Someone was typing as her. Her friends could tell almost immediately, even before they could explain how. The sentences were clipped in ways she never spoke. Words were misspelled that she would never misspell. Basic questions, the kind only she could answer, went unanswered or answered wrong. Whoever was sending those Facebook messages in her name, it was not Bethany Ann Decker. It would take 12 years to learn who, and by then, the answer had traveled through 2 more lives, a critical confrontation, a confession, and a location no one had thought to search back in the winter of 2011. Bethany was born in Fredericksburg, Virginia, in May of 1989, barely 5 feet tall, and by every account that survives her, the kind of person other people organize themselves around. Her mother, Kim, called her a joy from the day she was born, someone who had been smiling, in Kim's telling, since her very first hour. Her 2 younger siblings called her the leader of the pack, the one who set the tone, confident and encouraging in the way older sisters sometimes are and sometimes only pretend to be. She was smart in the specific way that frustrates teachers and delights them in equal measure. A former roommate remembered her putting off an essay until the night before it was due, writing it in a single hour and turning in something close to perfect. She earned a place at George Mason University, where she studied global and economic change, the kind of degree chosen by someone who assumed her 20s would be spent thinking about the world rather than fighting to stay afloat in it. She worked shifts at an Italian restaurant to help cover the difference between what school cost and what a young family could actually afford. It was at George Mason, in her freshman year, that she met Emil Decker, a cadet training with the Reserve Officers Training Corps, headed for the Army National Guard. Emil was, by every telling, a hopeless romantic, the sort of person who noticed the smallest offhand comment, the kind most people forget the moment they've said it, and remembered it for weeks, then acted on it. Bethany's family adored him almost instantly. He fit into their gatherings as though he had always been there. He proposed after a couple of years together, and not long after the engagement, Bethany discovered she was pregnant. Their son, Kai, arrived not long after they married in 2009. It was sooner than either of them had planned, but it was, by all accounts, a welcome surprise, the kind of surprise young couples convince themselves they can absorb. What followed was the familiar math of a young military family, the kind that rarely balances the way anyone hopes it will. Emil began training with his unit, then deploying overseas for months at a stretch. Bethany, meanwhile, was still working toward her degree, taking on restaurant shifts to cover what the guard's pay could not, raising a toddler largely on her own, in an apartment that felt smaller every month. When Emil learned he would be sent to Afghanistan, the strain that had been building for months tightened into something else entirely. Bethany told him she felt like they were drifting into separate lives, 2 people occupying the same marriage from opposite continents. She worried they had rushed into a wedding before either of them was ready for what marriage actually asked of them day to day. At some point that year, by several accounts, the 2 agreed to something like a trial separation. Emil did not want it. He told people later that he wanted, more than anything, to give Bethany whatever she needed, even if what she needed was distance. He left for Afghanistan, believing there was still something to come home to. Bethany moved into a new apartment in Ashburn, Virginia, closer to the restaurant where she worked, and picked up as many shifts as the schedule allowed. It was at that restaurant that everything changed. A 31-year-old co-worker named Ronald Ralden, originally from Bolivia, began spending time with her between shifts, the kind of easy familiarity that develops among people who share a stressful job. Before long, the 2 were involved, and Ralden moved into Bethany's apartment. Her best friend, Sarah, was stunned and said so more than once. But Bethany was lonely, isolated by a husband who existed mostly as a delayed voice on a satellite call, and she wanted, more than almost anything, to feel less alone in her own home. The relationship with Ralden was bad almost from the start, and everyone around her could see it, even if Bethany herself was slower to. He was controlling in a way that revealed itself gradually, in small demands that never stopped multiplying once they began. He wanted to know where she was and who she was with, and he wanted proof, not her word. He would call and text constantly, asking her to send a photograph confirming her location, and if she told him she was somewhere, he would drive there himself and sit outside in his car until she left, just to make certain she hadn't lied to him. Kim began to hear things that frightened her badly. She suspected, though she could never prove it, that Ralden's presence was harmful to Kai. The boy suffered an unexplained facial bruise around his first birthday, and the official explanation offered never sat right with the family. Kim did not believe it. Neither, apparently, did Kai, who by every account grew visibly anxious whenever Ralden came near him, showing a deep distress toddlers rarely display without a reason. There was one incident that Bethany's family would return to again and again in the years that followed, long before they understood its full weight. Ralden phoned Kai's daycare and pretended, on the call, to be Emil. It was a small thing, almost a footnote at the time, except that the daycare staff sensed something wrong in the voice on the line and refused to release any information about the boy. The family, badly shaken once they learned what had happened, worked out a code word with the daycare so that no one could be fooled again by a man pretending to be someone he was not. It would not be the last time. By the end of 2010, worn down, Bethany told Emil everything. She said she knew she had made a mistake. Emil, still overseas, told her his family remained his priority above anything else, and that he had sensed for months that something was wrong between them. She was working 6 days a week by then, and barely speaking to him when she did manage to call. They agreed, carefully, to try again once he came home on leave in January. Before he left Afghanistan, Emil recorded a short video message for his wife and son, a small piece of ordinary tenderness from a soldier far from home, wishing them a Merry Christmas he wasn't there to share, sending love to a family he was trying very hard not to lose. It was, without either of them knowing it yet, one of the last uncomplicated things either of them would say. When Emil landed in mid-January of 2011, there was one more complication waiting for him at the arrivals gate that no phone call had prepared him for. Bethany was pregnant again, and the father, this time, was Ronald Ralden. Emil said later that he wasn't angry, not really, that coming home from a war zone had recalibrated what mattered to him and what simply didn't anymore. He said being alive, being home, being near his family, made almost everything else feel small by comparison. The couple decided to go ahead with a trip they had already planned before any of this came out, a week together in Hawaii, and by every account it worked, at least for a little while. They laughed together for the first time in what felt like a long time. They talked instead of arguing. It felt, briefly, like something worth saving, the way a fading photograph can look sharp again if you don't look too closely. They flew home on the 28th of January and spent that night at Bethany's grandparents' house in Columbia, Maryland, making homemade pizza together and talking about the trip late into the evening. Her grandmother sensed there were more stories underneath the ones Bethany was telling, currents she wasn't ready to name out loud, but didn't press her. Bethany later confided to those closest to her that she felt like she was drowning that week, that it was the lowest point of her entire life so far. That evening, during dinner with Emil and her grandparents, her phone began ringing without warning. She gathered her things and left abruptly, telling the family they didn't understand what would happen to her if she didn't go home right then. Emil was due to fly back to Afghanistan in a matter of days. The plan, as they left it, was that Bethany would meet him at the airport to see him off, the way she always had, no matter what else was happening between them. She told him, before they parted that night, that she would always be there for him no matter what. The next morning, the 29th of January, Emil saw Bethany one final time before she drove back to the Ashburn apartment to get ready for the week ahead. Ronald Ralden would later tell investigators that he saw her there that same afternoon. Sometime around 2 o'clock, Bethany called the restaurant to confirm her shifts for the coming week, sounding, according to the manager who took the call, entirely like herself. It was the last confirmed contact anyone would ever have with her. On the 2nd of February, Emil arrived at the airport, expecting to see his wife one final time before boarding his return flight. She never came. He called her restaurant and was told she hadn't been in for days. Before he flew out, worried now, he called her family to say something felt wrong, that whatever their problems had been, Bethany had never once missed an airport goodbye before. For the first stretch of February, no one panicked, not exactly. Bethany's family said it wasn't unusual for her to disappear into her own overloaded life for days at a stretch, buried under restaurant shifts, coursework, and a toddler who needed constant attention. Then the messages began. Kim started receiving strange phone calls she could never fully explain or trace. Bethany's friend Sarah logged into Facebook one evening and saw that Bethany appeared to be online, and struck up a conversation, and knew almost immediately that something was deeply wrong. The English was broken in ways Bethany's never was. The details were vague, exactly where they should have been specific and personal. Emil, halfway around the world, received an email from her account and had the identical reaction. Eventually, 4 separate people independently told Kim they believed Bethany's account had been compromised by someone else entirely. Bethany's grandparents, who lived closer to the apartment than anyone else in the family, drove over themselves to check on her. They found her car sitting in the lot, parked at an odd angle, coated in dust, one tire completely flat. No one recalled seeing it parked like that before. It seemed, unsettlingly, to have simply appeared there. They knocked on the apartment door. Nothing answered but silence on the other side. On the 19th of February, 2011, they called the police, and Bethany Decker was officially reported missing, 3 full weeks after anyone had spoken to her for certain. Investigators moved quickly once they understood the shape of what they were looking at. A pregnant 21-year-old, gone for 3 weeks, with no activity whatsoever on her phone, her bank accounts, or her credit cards since the 29th of January. She hadn't shown up to a single class at George Mason. She hadn't checked into any hospital in the region. Her passport was still sitting in the apartment, so she hadn't left the country. Inside the apartment itself, nothing appeared disturbed in any obvious way. No forced entry, no visible struggle. Her belongings all still there, untouched, as if she had simply stepped out for a moment and never come back through the door. Detectives searched fields near the apartment complex on their hands and knees. Divers searched the nearby water. The FBI was brought in to assist. National cable news picked the story up quickly, the way it tends to when the missing woman is young, pregnant, and married to a soldier serving overseas. A segment on Nancy Grace's program that spring gave the case its widest audience yet, and with it, thousands of amateur theories that mostly went nowhere. A criminal profiler, asked about the case on a different broadcast not long afterward, said only that something about it didn't sit right, that a young woman could theoretically vanish and slowly resurface on her own terms, but that investigators clearly weren't ready to rule anything out yet, because there were still far too many open questions to responsibly close any of them off. None of it, for months on end, produced anything solid enough for the family to actually hold on to. Sheriff Steve Simpson, fielding questions from a local reporter later that year, put the frustration of those early months about as plainly as a lawman ever does in public. He said his office believed they had already spoken to people who knew more than they were willing to share, and that he hoped, given enough time, those people would come to understand that no detail was too small to matter. It was, in its way, an appeal aimed at exactly one person, even if the sheriff never said his name out loud. 2 men had reason to know what happened to Bethany that day, and investigators looked hard at both of them, methodically and without favoritism. Emil, who had left the country around the same time she vanished and had just learned his wife was carrying another man's child, submitted to hours of interrogation and a polygraph test, voluntarily, more than once, answering every question twice over no matter how painful it was to hear. He was, eventually, cleared entirely. His movements between the 28th of January and the 2nd of February were accounted for down to the hour, corroborated by the Army's own investigators, who helped detectives reach him overseas by phone before flying him home to cooperate in person. Ronald Ralden told a different story than Emil had told. According to his account, he was the one who last saw Bethany, not on the 28th, but on the afternoon of the 29th, inside the apartment, seeming entirely like herself. This was partly supported by the restaurant, which confirmed she had called around 2 in the afternoon to lock in her schedule, though she never showed up for the very shift she had just confirmed. Bank records showed Ralden withdrew cash that same afternoon at 4:26. He sent Bethany 2 text messages that day, one just after 4 o'clock, one just after 4:30, telling her he would be staying with his own 2 children that night at their mother's apartment. Whether Bethany ever received either message remains unknown. Her phone, according to the records, had already gone dark by then. Ralden's ex-girlfriend, Danielle, confirmed she dropped their 2 children off with him around 4:30 that afternoon, and that Ralden told her at the time he wasn't sure if Bethany would even be coming back, that the 2 of them had fought and she'd stormed off. When Danielle returned days later to collect the children, Ralden told her, again, that he still hadn't heard a word from Bethany. He had not reported her missing himself. His explanation, when pressed, was that the relationship was already effectively over by then, so her silence hadn't seemed like something that was his responsibility to raise with anyone. A background check on him turned up an old arrest for identity theft, along with convictions for public intoxication and, years earlier, smashing a woman's car window during an unrelated dispute. None of it, on its own, tied him directly to Bethany's disappearance. A search warrant was issued for his apartment anyway, with the paperwork citing an offense far graver than abduction as a possibility. Investigators seized his phones, his laptop, his hard drives, hoping something buried in the data would tell them what his own words wouldn't. They found nothing usable. Ralden, who had cooperated at first, if reluctantly, stopped cooperating altogether not long after. From that point forward, he was described publicly only as a person of interest. Never, at that stage, a suspect. Never, at that stage, charged. The months went on, and then the years did too. On what would have been Bethany's 23rd birthday, which fell that year on Mother's Day, family and friends gathered to keep her name in the public eye, handing out flyers, giving interviews, refusing to let the case fade quietly the way so many do. They cut a cake in her favorite color, orange, and stood together in a park while the story ran on local news that night. Kim connected, around this time, with the family of Morgan Harrington, a young woman whose own disappearance years earlier had gone unsolved for a long, agonizing stretch before it finally wasn't. The 2 mothers understood something about each other's ordeal that almost no one else could. Late in 2012, the television series Disappeared aired a full episode built around Bethany's case, titled simply, "Bethany is Gone," and for a while afterward, the tip line got noticeably busier. Then, inevitably, it went quiet again. Emil eventually filed for divorce from his missing wife and was awarded sole custody of Kai, raising the boy alone as the years accumulated without an answer. Ralden, through an attorney, issued the only public statement he would make for years, saying only that he remained hopeful. Bethany would come home, that he prayed for her daily, and that he had nothing to hide from anyone. What almost no one watching the case from the outside understood during those quiet years was that Ronald Ralden had not stopped. He had simply moved on to someone else. He drifted first to a new job in Manassas and began seeing a co-worker there named April, a waitress, much like Bethany had once been. It didn't last long. During an argument, Ralden turned aggressive, throwing April's belongings outside and physically forcing her down a flight of stairs, resulting in severe physical danger. She pressed charges against him. He paid her $2,500 to make it disappear, and the charges were dropped soon after. At the time, to anyone not already watching closely, it barely registered as news at all. A private argument between two people who worked together, resolved quietly and privately with a check. No one connected it to Ashburn. No one was looking for a pattern yet, because no one outside Ralden's own relationships had any reason to believe there was one. In hindsight, it reads as something else entirely. A smaller, quieter rehearsal of a pattern that had already claimed one woman and was about to nearly claim a second, playing out in plain sight while the case that mattered most sat untouched in a filing cabinet 2 counties away. Not long after, still in the Manassas area, Ralden met Vicky Willoughby, also at a restaurant, and the two began a relationship. She had 3 children of her own from before, and when Ralden hit a rough financial patch, she agreed to let him move into a spare room in her home for a couple of months while he got back on his feet. It was not, by her own account, a serious relationship at first. But the same pattern that had governed Bethany's final year began asserting itself in Vicky's life almost immediately, as though it were simply how Ralden understood love to work. He grew controlling in stages, the way he always did. He isolated her, first gently from her friends, then more forcefully from her own family, until eventually she wasn't permitted to text, email, or call anyone at all without his knowledge and his say-so. He threatened the people who still mattered most to her. He told her, more than once, almost casually, that he could make people disappear. Then, a friend of Vicky's happened to see a news segment about Bethany Decker's case, one that named Ronald Ralden directly as a person of interest in a missing woman's disappearance. The friend told Vicky immediately. Vicky confronted him about it that same day. His reaction, she said afterward, terrified her in a way nothing before it ever had. She understood in that single moment that he now knew she knew, and that whatever fragile balance had existed in the relationship had just shifted permanently and irreversibly. She decided, quietly, that she had to get away from him for good. She quit her job and moved into a house she still owned outright in Pinehurst, North Carolina, hoping the distance alone would be enough. Ralden found out almost immediately and told her flatly that he was coming with her. She did not feel, by that point, that she had any real way to say no to him. By the time they had both settled in North Carolina, Vicky had begun quietly keeping a private log of what she started calling his episodes, numbering them one by one, documenting the pattern for no one's benefit but her own, in case she ever needed proof that any of it had actually happened. She got into the habit of unlocking every door in the house each morning before he woke, just in case she ever needed to run without stopping to fumble with a lock. She hid 2 revolvers in 2 different rooms, one tucked beneath the dog's bed, one wedged into the cushions of a living room chair, and told absolutely no one, including him, exactly where either one was. On a night in the middle of November 2014, Ralden went to bed as usual, then got back up without a word and took Vicky's phone and her laptop away from her before she could react. What happened next unfolded in the kind of silence that tends to precede real violence. No shouting first, no warning. He turned on her physically, a sudden and brutal physical assault that left her fighting for her life. Somewhere in the middle of the struggle, she managed to reach a defensive firearm she had hidden in the chair cushions and discharged it in self-defense. It did not stop him. If anything, it made him angrier. He disarmed her and turned the weapon back on her, inflicting a critical injury to her head with a projectile that remains lodged there to this day, too dangerous to ever remove. She lay still for a moment afterward, genuinely believing she was about to die on that floor. Then, somehow, against every likelihood, she didn't. She made it out the door and into the dark, running half-dressed through the November night to a neighbor's house, pounding desperately on the glass until someone finally let her in. Vicky Willoughby survived that night, but only barely, suffering irreversible physical loss and traumatic injuries to her spine. Ronald Ralden, notably, never even tried to run. He was still inside Vicky's house when police finally arrived, and he surrendered without a shred of resistance, as if the fight had simply gone out of him the moment hers had stopped. Both of them were rushed to the hospital that night. Vicky spent 5 brutal days fighting for her life in intensive care before doctors were confident she would live. Ralden, once he recovered from his own injuries, was eventually charged, though not at first with attempted murder. The initial charges were lesser assault counts, part of a legal process that would, months later, produce a plea deal Vicky came to describe bitterly as a slap in the face. He was ultimately sentenced to a minimum of 6 years, with the expectation that once his sentence concluded, he would be deported outright to Bolivia, administratively, the way thousands of cases end every year, without anyone outside a courthouse ever hearing the name again. Had that deportation gone forward on its original schedule, Bethany's case might well have stayed exactly where it had sat for most of a decade already. Open, unresolved, its one real person of interest permanently out of reach on another continent. From a prison cell in North Carolina, it must have looked, to Ronald Ralden, like the story was over. It was not. Vicky, once she had recovered enough to speak publicly about what had happened to her, began telling anyone who would listen exactly what Ralden had said to her the night he nearly took her life, and what she had since come to believe it meant about the woman who vanished years before she ever met him. She reached out directly to Kim Nelson, a stranger to her in every sense except one. The two women, connected only by the same man's hands, became close in a way neither of them could have predicted, sitting together later through years of hearings neither wanted to attend. Detectives working Bethany's case traveled out to the North Carolina prison to speak with Ralden again, hoping his circumstances had changed his willingness to talk. They had not. He refused outright, shouting and swearing at them through the interview room, saying nothing of any use. But the case, cold for the better part of a decade, had a pulse again, and this time it belonged to a woman who had lived long enough to describe, in detail, exactly what he was capable of doing to someone who tried to leave him. In 2019, investigators finally obtained and executed a long-delayed search warrant on Bethany's Facebook account, years after the strange messages that had first raised alarm bells in her family back in 2011. What they found confirmed, at last, what Sarah and Kim had suspected from the very beginning. The account that had been posting as Bethany in the weeks after she vanished, the one with the broken English and the answers that never quite fit, had been accessed from the exact same IP address as Ronald Ralden's own personal account, again and again, in the days immediately surrounding her disappearance. Someone had spent weeks that winter pretending, badly, to be a missing woman, answering just enough messages to keep the people who loved her from calling the police any sooner than they already had. It had worked for a while. Grief, it turns out, is patient, but suspicion is more patient still, and eventually the two collided in a data request that took the better part of a decade to file. Now, finally, there was a name attached to the pretending. In November of 2020, as Ralden's North Carolina sentence came to an end and formal deportation proceedings loomed on the horizon, the Loudoun County Sheriff's Office moved first, decisively, before anyone else could act. They obtained a fresh warrant, drove down to North Carolina themselves, and brought Ralden back to Virginia the moment he was released, before Immigration and Customs Enforcement had the chance to send him anywhere else in the world. He was charged with abduction. Held without bond from the start, he sat through his first video arraignment in a striped jail uniform, wearing glasses, showing almost no visible reaction, as a judge calmly explained the maximum penalty he was now facing. A month later, in December, the charge was upgraded to something far more serious: second-degree murder. The case dragged through the machinery of the court for 2 more long years after that. A judge denied Ralden bond outright in the spring of 2022, citing both the seriousness of the new charge and what had happened to Vicki Willoughby in North Carolina years earlier, ruling plainly that releasing him back into the community would pose a real and present danger. His defense attorneys tried repeatedly to keep jurors from ever hearing about that North Carolina attack or about the long pattern of abuse Bethany's own family had described going back to 2010. The judge refused every time. The trial date moved more than once, pushed back again and again as evidence was reviewed, as filings piled up in the clerk's office. At one point, prosecutors turned over roughly 60,000 pages of case material to the defense, the accumulated weight of a decade's worth of tips, interviews, and dead ends, and the defense team asked for still more time simply to read through it. A case built almost entirely on circumstance, with no body and no confirmed crime scene, inched slowly toward a courtroom that might never have been able to prove, beyond doubt, what everyone closest to it already believed in their bones. It never reached that courtroom at all. On the 17th of November, 2022, Ronald Ralden entered a guilty plea for the unlawful death of Bethany Decker. Commonwealth's attorney Bhuta Bibaraj, addressing reporters afterward, thanked the detective who had spent years on the file and extended her office's condolences to a family that had waited longer for an answer than Bethany herself had been alive to give one. For weeks afterward, the actual circumstances of what had happened to her that January afternoon remained sealed from the public, a condition of the plea agreement that had bought him a considerably lighter sentence in exchange for his eventual cooperation with investigators. For 12 years, through every interview, every refusal, every silence in a prison meeting room, Ralden had maintained one consistent position: that he had nothing to do with her disappearance and that he had never touched her Facebook account. The IP records obtained in 2019 had already proven the second claim false. The plea, when it finally came, disposed of the first. On the 9th of January, 2023, inside the Loudoun County Adult Detention Center, Ronald Ralden finally told investigators what he claimed had actually happened, nearly 12 full years after the fact. He said the two of them had argued that January afternoon about her going back to work for another shift, an argument that, by his own account, escalated fast. He said he pushed her. He said she fell and struck her head against the windowsill, and that when he checked on her afterward, he found no signs of life left in her at all. He admitted he panicked in that moment and never called for help, instead concealing her inside a large storage bag before taking her down through the complex and disposing of her in the building's central waste disposal system. It is, as far as anyone has ever been able to determine since, the last place Bethany Decker is believed to have been. On the 21st of February, 2023, Ronald Ralden stood before Judge Alfred Swirsky to be formally sentenced. Asked directly if he had anything he wished to say, he told the judge he did not, and said nothing further. he was sentenced to the maximum term allowed for second-degree murder under Virginia law, 40 years, with all but 12.5 years suspended, and a further 25 years of supervised release once he is eventually let out, during which he remains barred from any contact whatsoever with Bethany's surviving family. If he offends again during that period, or violates any condition of his release, the full original sentence can be reinstated in full. Once his time is finally served, deportation to Bolivia still waits for him at the other end, the very same ending that had already been delayed once, by nearly a decade, and by the fact that no one has ever been able to find her. In the courtroom that day, there was no dramatic outburst, no tearful confession beyond the flat, procedural account he had already given weeks earlier in a jail meeting room. Ralden stood, listened, said nothing, and was led away, the same way he had reportedly walked out of Vicky Willoughby's house a decade earlier, offering no resistance to anything, as though resistance had only ever been something he reserved for the people who couldn't fight back. Outside the courthouse that February afternoon, Kim Nelson stood beside Vicky Willoughby, the woman whose own survival had ultimately reopened her daughter's case after years of silence, the way the two of them had stood together through so many hearings by then. Kim later said what stayed with her most afterward was not the sentence itself, or even the confession, but a single phone call from the night before. Bethany disappeared when her daughter had called simply to say, "I love you, Mom," before hanging up. It was the very last thing Bethany Decker ever said to her mother. 12 years is a long time to spend waiting for an answer that turns out, in the end, to be this small and this ordinary. A trash compactor, a disagreement over a work shift, a windowsill. No elaborate plan, no long-hidden grave dug in advance, nothing about it that explains itself as anything other than exactly what it was. A man who could not tolerate being told no, and a young woman who tried to tell him anyway, on an ordinary Saturday afternoon, in an apartment that looked, to everyone who searched it afterward, entirely undisturbed. Kim Nelson still works, all these years later, with an organization founded in Morgan Harrington's memory, dedicated to teaching young people about safety and the earliest warning signs of controlling relationships, turning her own daughter's story into something that might, in theory, protect someone else's. Bethany has never been found, and investigators believe now, honestly, that she likely never will be. What remains of her instead are the things people said about her while she was still there to hear them, and the things she said herself, in her own actual voice, before anyone else ever tried to speak for her, badly, in her place. Somewhere in an old server, a set of Facebook messages still technically exists, written in someone else's clumsy words, pretending to be a woman who could no longer speak for herself. And somewhere else entirely, in a mother's memory, 4 different words remain, ones nobody else ever typed for her, and nobody else ever could have. But some things do not come back.